So, kids, we are live today. I have a member of the YouTube Illuminati with us. It is Apollonian Germ, and he's come on. He's come on to talk about a variety of different topics. We're going to talk on the Scamdemic. We're going to talk about the Rothschilds, of course, and the globalist elite. And we're going to talk about Keith Woods and Greg Johnson and others. So, Apollonian Germ, very much welcome to you to come on the show. How are you today?
I'm doing well. Thank you, Thomas. It's good to be with you. I've only recently discovered your channel, actually, maybe a month or two ago, I'd say. And it was actually one of your videos on Keith Woods that brought me to you. And I was so impressed by your vitriol, your attack on Keith Woods, because I've made some videos in the past myself, and I try, as much as I admire your directness and your clarity and how much you despise this guy. I've made videos in the past kind of obliquely referencing his ideas, and because I try to stick with ideas a lot of the time and make it more general, make it more of a broad issue. But I've made videos attacking his ideas before, and people recognize that I'm talking about Keith Woods regardless. And so I've had some of his fanboys come into the comments, and just from interacting with his fanboys, it tells me a lot about his viewership, and a lot of people just defend him religiously, and it's
I when I first came onto YouTube for the first 3 years, I didn't make response videos to anyone. Then I went through a phase of obliquely referencing people in response videos, and no one ever knew who I was talking about. And so eventually I just got so mad that I got to the point where I was like, right, I'm just going to call people out. And to be honest, I think that's the best way to do it. But Apollonian Germ, before we get into Keith Woods, do you want to give people a brief resume of, what was your political journey and how you got, to where you are, or what indeed are your main political opinions?
Sure. I'll try to be as brief as I can, because I can ramble on this for a couple hours, I'm sure. But so I got a bachelor's degree at the University of Illinois, Chicago, majoring in philosophy. And that whole experience in academia brought me from being sort of an anarcho-capitalist type, which is what I was when I was 18, 19. I was a big fan of Stefan Molyneux and School Sucks podcast. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. A lot of the libertarian, like Milton Friedman and those kind of Jews. I was a big fan of them because I, growing up, had I had a feeling that that there was a problem with the state, that there was a problem with the way society was headed. There was a problem with how things were run and the way that society seemed to be getting worse and worse over time. I definitely had nostalgia for the 1950s, and even the 19th century to me for a long time was, and still is, a nostalgic period for me. And so I always wondered why society is going in the direction it's going. And I ended up blaming the government, which made me into this hardcore anarcho-capitalist because of, like I said, the people I was influenced by. But after studying philosophy in academia and exposing myself, because I've always been a very curious person, I've always been interested in what people are saying online and finding alternative opinions. And one thing that got me into, I guess, alternative political theories was 9/11, which you talk about 9/11. I remember I was how old was I? 11 years old, I think, when 9/11 happened. No, younger than that. I was like 9 or 10 years old when 9/11 happened, but I remember it vividly, and it never seemed real to me. And so getting into those conspiracies as I grew up brought me down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theories in general. And so my distrust and hatred of the state combined with general interest in conspiracies and secrets, government secrets, those kinds of things sort of converged when I got into college and I was confronted with like the anti-white agenda, the what I would call like anti-reality agenda of like the trans stuff that's pushed onto kids, the gender stuff that's pushed onto kids, and well, especially the anti-European, anti-white stuff that's pushed. And so all of that kind of like led me to wondering like, why is this happening? And it took me the time that I was in college to start researching like really who's behind this and where this all came from. And I started to discover that the you-know-whos were pushing a lot of this, and that this goes back to a time in the early 20th century that we can't really speak about. And all of this stuff sort of, I'm kind of rambling here, but basically it took me figuring out the real genealogy of the political climate and the social climate today and who is behind it. Oh, and another thing, this is, I don't mean to go on for too long, but another thing that got me thinking about who, like really, instead of it, this is something that I think we'll end up getting into with Keith Woods, is I became focused on the question of who is behind this as like a real focused, targeted question, because I got into a group called the Rational Scientific Method. And this doesn't seem related, but a guy called Bill Gates created this scientific method called the Rational Scientific Method, where instead of focusing on experimentation and the traditional sort of experimental method of testing and data gathering and testing again, etc., he has this method of what he calls rational explanation, which he says if a physical event happens in reality, we have to be able to assume that an object caused that event. And so I started rethinking everything in terms of objects causing events, as opposed to the way that a lot of people understand history today and social issues today, is they ask the question of, oh, is it what abstract concept is causing this? Is it liberalism? Is it Marxism? Is it capitalism? They're always trying to create these abstractions to explain things. Whereas after the Rational Scientific Method, I realized that we need to be asking what objects, what physical, what people are out there in the world working together to do things, because nothing gets done without objects. Nothing gets done without people working in a purposeful way. So I started to wonder like who these people are and figuring out that genealogy, and that's...
Sure. To go back to 9/11, it's very interesting that you say that you were 9 or 10 when 9/11 happened. I was actually 21. And this, I think, although, see, I often, nobody makes a big thing of age in the distant right, but I do think it matters, because I was born in 1980, and I think it makes a massive difference from people who were maybe just 10 or 15 years younger than me. I mean, 9/11 was a seminal event in my life, now that I look back on it. And it ultimately, although it took me, I was 33 when I got red pilled, which is very, very late compared to a lot of people in the distant right.
It's very Masonic.
Well, it's even, well, actually, I think I was 33 and a third when I woke up to 9/11. So it's terrifying. But anyway, I think we should come to Keith Woods. And I think the best way to get into this, because I know you want to talk about Keith Woods, kind of his idea of history compared to your interpretation of it. But I think first and foremost, we should just start with Keith Woods's reaction to the scamdemic, and also the reaction of people like Greg Johnson to the scamdemic. So can you come to that? And let me just tell you, I must shut a window. I'll be back. So just continue speaking to the people, and I'll just be 2 ticks.
Sure. Well, I think a lot of people, Keith Woods and people he's associated with, took the scamdemic as a moment to shill for government power and national power. And I think that this was like a misplaced motivation, because I saw a lot of people with these ideas like, oh yeah, COVID, they're closing the borders now, and this is the end of globalism. This is a proof that globalism is failing, and all this kind of crap that just never materialized. And if these people weren't so what's the right word? If they weren't so afraid, I think, of conspiracy, of the just putting out the ideas of conspiracy theory, and they're so they mock the ideas of conspiracy theories, and they keep to these very kosher academic interpretations of things, that they can't, and this is something you've talked about, Thomas, something they can't really fully understand the world in the way that conspiracy theorists like us do, which allows us to look at events like the COVID scamdemic and put it into this greater context of how the elites work, how they create chaos and use events, use these dialectics, use controlled opposition on both sides, all these kinds of tactics that they use to further their agenda in the long run. They can't see that, I think, because they are they just want to stay away from conspiracy theories for whatever reason. I can assign any kind of motivations to them. I don't know what motivations you think they have. I think you think they're stupid, probably, but
it's funny what you say. There's a lovely meme that I've seen doing the rounds, which is a lot of people on the distant right. What they basically said was, well, we might have surrendered power to the you-know-whos, but at least they don't think we're crazy conspiracy theorists. And I think in some ways it is about social embarrassment, about going near conspiracy theories, but it might also just be stupidity. I'm really not so sure. I don't know. I could spend all day trying to fathom these people.
Well, it might also be a conflict of interest, because there are, I think that there are actual agents that work within the alt-right that are conscious of their manipulations, that they're conscious of this misdirection that they're accomplishing. People like Richard Spencer, like Jason Reza Giorgiani. I mean, Giorgiani openly admitted that he's worked with the deep state, and he was proud of that. Like, he's proud of these connections that he had. And so I think that there are people in that milieu that set the tone and that bring money into the picture. And I mean, this is I don't want to do too much speculation on this, but I think that is another possibility, that there are people inserted into key positions that then define the direction that the movement goes in. And if you want to be associated with them, because someone like Keith Woods gained a lot of his popularity by being associated with someone like Richard Spencer. So it just, there's the carrot and stick kind of thing, where people will unconsciously go with whatever brings them the most popularity and success.
Yes, absolutely. Richard Spencer is, I made a video back in 2016. It was saying, look, this guy's, he's an agent, he's an FBI agent or whatever. He's working for the elites, and he's going to lead you down a blind valley. So it's obvious to me that Spencer, is an agent. But the other issue I was going to say is, the other thing which I think is really important is that I think a lot of people just respond to authority. And what happened was, because the elites were like, we're rolling out a police state, there's going to be tanks on the streets. A lot of these people just like think, hey, that's quite good. I don't care if you're my enemy. If you're being very forceful, I'm just going to applaud that and lie down. And that's why I think a lot of this kind of the hatred of the you-know-whos comes from a place of thinking that they're very weak and very pathetic, which is the ultimate sort of belief in Hollywood propaganda, in my opinion. And so a lot of these people on the distant right like to bully the weak little you-know-who. And yet, when the Rothschilds do something like this and really go full force with it, they just sort of accept it and they quite like it, I would say.
I know you've said that about, I think Mike Enoch in particular, how he's bullying the you-know-whos, but yeah, I don't know about, maybe that fits for some people, but
if you feel free to disagree, by the way, Mike.
Yeah,
that's absolutely fine.
I'm happy to disagree, but in this case, there's it's just, that's a road that the conversation doesn't need to lead down right now.
Okay.
Well, we could talk about my personal hatred of the you-know-who's.
Yes. Well, shall we do that in the second hour?
Yeah.
Once we've got this Keith Woods stuff up.
Yeah, let's continue with the Keith Woods.
Because I think lots of people do have a problem with my interpretation of the you-know-who's. So I think that's something they would like to hear. Let me just say something to the chat, actually, because before the conversation, Mike said we'll have things to disagree on. And I said to him, well, actually, it's very rare that I have genuine conspiracy theorists on the channel. Most people who come on my channel, probably think I'm a bit of a tinfoil nutcase. There's very few people who actually come on and have, basic agreements with me about my conspiracy beliefs. But anyway, let's go further with Keith Woods then, because you made a good video a while back where you suggested that Keith Woods believes that sort of, things like the Bolshevik Revolution were caused by the people, for example. And you said that actually these things were carried out by, central banking forces, that kind of thing. Do you want to speak a bit about this?
Yeah. And so one thing that I would say about your videos on Keith Woods that I wish you would get more into are these details about why him and his brand of, you rightly label cultural Marxism, why that's wrong. I would say that there are, I guess, two approaches to this conversation. There are the details that I disagree with, and then there's kind of a big picture disagreement that I have. And I don't know which one to start with, but I guess the big picture is something I alluded to earlier, which is his whole philosophy of explanation revolves around coming up with how these abstractions like capitalism lead to certain consequences or effects in society. And I think that that's the wrong approach, because when you really get into these genealogies that I talked about earlier, you will see that this dichotomy between socialism or communism on one side and capitalism or liberalism on the other side is a false dichotomy, and that at the very top of both of these systems that have existed in society, there are deep webs of interconnected elite families, elite institutions, banks, international banks, and of course the ethnic group that ties a lot of it together, the religious ethnic group that ties a lot of it together. And someone like Marx and himself, and this is something that Keith Woods even openly admits and talks about, but I don't think he grasps the significance of this. Someone like Marx himself was funded and promoted by industrial elites like his uncle Phillips, and so he has connections to the top level of industry industrial capitalists, at the same time as promoting something that is ostensibly anti-capitalist. And once you recognize that, you got to start thinking critically about this. One of the biggest issues that I have that is over the past couple days leading up to this conversation, I watched a couple Keith Woods videos just to refresh myself on how he talks. I had to watch them at like 1.5 speed because it's some of it is kind of slow and painful. But one of the things that he does is he takes this very naive view of communism in particular. And he says, people who say that what the elites want is communism, they're wrong, because communism, by definition, is when the means of production are shared in common by the working class, and private property is abolished. And these capitalist elites, they don't want that. They don't want private property to be abolished. This whole meme of global communism, that's an old Red Scare shit, and that is the most naive view of communism you could take, because when you start getting into it, and you really start thinking about whether or not something like that is even possible, I think any rational thinker would come to the conclusion that this idea of a classless society with no hierarchy and all of the means of production, which is a vague concept that could be anything from a printer that I use to make things versus the land that I use to grow things. Anything can be deemed means of production if it's a productive object. So this idea that the means of production can be shared in common and private property can be abolished and everything is held in commune. I don't know if you want to get into that, but philosophically and conceptually, I think that that's impossible. That will never happen, and it never has happened. And in every case, in every instance of communism that we've seen in history, that has not happened. And what has really happened is you have an authoritarian elite that strips the average person of all their private property, takes it into the control of the state, and distributes it how they will. And you have this upper echelon that controls and dominates all the average people. Like when the communists took over, they basically robbed all of the middle class farmers of their land. Like these kinds of things, that's what happens. It's not possible for this naive view of communism to occur in reality or even conceptually, I think. So to take this naive view of communism, it just misdirects people. It leads people down. I would say Keith Woods in a video said that to call communism just this authoritarian dictatorship kind of a thing is to take the meaning away from communism. But I think that's the only actual meaning of communism in practice, in reality. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, it's funny what you say about what happened in the Bolshevik Revolution, whereby the middle class lost a lot of their property. And because something similar is essentially going on now with this, with this lockdown stuff. Keith Woods, by his advocacy of this global lockdown, has consigned a lot of small and medium-sized businesses to extinction. So as per usual, these kind of commie types are never on the side of the working man or the middle class man or the small business, and that it's not malevolence. I think it's just he's too stupid to realize it. To go back to the Bolshevik Revolution, what I personally think is that if all of this was a big fight between the Rothschilds and the Romanovs being the Tsarist family of Russia, the Romanovs didn't want to join the international banking cartel. And that was in 1815 or something. They gave the Rothschilds the finger and said, we're not joining. And then, about 100 years later, the Rothschilds had broken down. Well, they had used cultural Marxism for the next 100 years, and they infected Russia with that disease. So that 100 years later, the Bolshevik Revolution was ripe and ready to take place. And so when the Bolsheviks killed the Tsar, that was really just the Rothschilds killing the Tsar. and taking over. That would be my take on that. I don't know what you think about that.
No, that I essentially agree with that. And so one thing about communist Russia that I think a lot of these Nats Bowl types, that's another label I would give to like Keith Woods and his ilk, cultural Marxist Nats Bowl, National Bolshevik types, is they will say things like, oh yeah, but this isn't cultural Marxism, because when you look at these Marxist societies like Russia under Stalin, for example, oh, well, he abolished gay marriage, and he was anti-Zionist, and all these kinds of things that they'll say is like, oh, well, yeah, but under the Marxist society in Stalinist Russia, they were more traditional. They upheld these traditional values. And to that, I would say, first of all, the purpose, I think, of cultural Marxism in the West right now is not the end in itself. Like the elites don't have an inherent value for gay marriage or trans acceptance or anti-racism or things of that nature. I don't think they inherently care about those things as values in themselves. They use those as tools to destabilize a society so that they can assume absolute power and pilfer their treasuries and make themselves insanely rich and powerful. It has nothing to do with, they don't value those things in themselves. So once the Bolsheviks took over in Russia and had that absolute control and were completely raping that country for all the wealth that they could, and they had absolute power, they no longer needed to promote things that destabilized the society. It was already destabilized. They already won. And someone like Stalin in particular, I read something like, oh yeah, Stalin was an anti-Semite and he kicked out all the Jews from the high places of Soviet power. There's actually a case to be made that Stalin himself was a crypto Jew. And I don't know if you've looked into Stalin's biography much, but there's a paper by Miles Mathis, I don't know if you know of him, who talks about Stalin. And he, the couple of facts about Stalin are he had a Jewish wife who he had a Jewish child with. He was, I think, one of his first jobs was for a Rothschild firm. There are a few things to make that argument there too. So
yes, this brings me to a very good point, which is that a lot of people think that if, let's say, like what Stalin did, something like that, then that is absolute proof that he is against the you-know-whos. But this is a classic technique that they've used since a long, long time, which is that they will happily take the hit on something like that just to convince the normies, let's say, that they're being persecuted. But it often turns out that the people doing the persecution are fighting for the same side as well. And I think there's an awful lot of people in distant right circles who will always just believe like the first and most obvious truth, and they will never look deeper. What was I going to say? Yeah, there's lots of things I could say. I mean, yeah, I think I was going to mention the McCarthy era stuff, because a lot of people say in our circles, oh, the McCarthy era stuff, like McCarthy was fighting communists. And McCarthy, he often gets, people talk about the McCarthy witch hunts, but actually anyone who is red-pilled will know that McCarthy was probably a good guy, fighting cultural Marxists. The thing is, however, is that when he was doing that, the game was already lost, because America had already been infected by cultural Marxism going back to the 19th century. So even if McCarthy had some kind of power, he wouldn't have, he was essentially rearranging the deck chairs at that point, I would say. But these kind of complex and deep sort of issues are often missed, I think.
Yeah, that idea of people taking history at face value. Often, what will happen with history is you'll get like 2 or 3 alternative stories from the mainstream itself, and people will question the most mainstream theory, find this alternative mainstream theory essentially, and then cling to that because they doubted the first level of the matrix, got to the second level and sort of latched onto that, because it's hard to really get to the bottom of things, I think, especially if you don't take this holistic view of looking at things like genealogies, the families behind things. And one, talking about like how far back this goes, I did a video reading an article from the Saturday Evening Post. I don't know if you saw that, but it was written by a military reporter back in the early 20th century, and it was called The Unseen Masters of Europe or something along those lines. And he shows how even as far back as then, the central banks and the who-ish Rothschilds, Warburgs, I used to have all their names memorized, but all these, top banking families were already 100% in power. And the importance of that, because I think a lot of people will think like, oh, okay, so these banking families, the who's were in power, so what? The importance of it is, and I've done some work on this in the past, modern socialism, I think there's an argument to be made that modern socialism comes out of these esoteric and mystical understandings of Judaism and Kabbalah. And a lot of it comes right out of that mysticism. So it's that's a puzzle piece that people need to understand, because otherwise it's like, why is it that the who's are the ones behind this? What does that have to do with their religion? What does it have to do with that group as a whole? And you have to go back and look at how Kabbalah and those mystical views of reality and of human nature play into it, which we probably don't have time to get into today, but
there's an awful lot to unpack. Let's come to some of that stuff, I think, in the second hour. I mean, another thing I was going to say is that if you look back to when like the Rothschilds took over with this conspiracy, which I believe was about 250 years ago, the original Rothschild was a sort of, he was a peasant born in the Frankfurt ghetto, and he managed to get a job in the bank working for the Oppenheimers, I think it was. But the thing is that at that time, you see, the who's were consigned to the Frankfurt ghetto. They had to go around with little armbands on, and I think they were hated by the German population. But you see, that seems to me like a big trick, because if someone from the Frankfurt ghetto can suddenly go to work in one of the banks owned by the Oppenheimers and immediately rise to the top of the banking world, it seems to me that what the who's were doing back in the day, they were psyoping the Germans into believing that the who's were just like this tiny little group that lived in the ghetto. They had to be locked up at 9 o'clock at night. They all had little yellow bands on, and probably Germans believed this and thought, oh well, we don't like having them here, but at least our authorities are doing something about them, keeping them confined to the ghetto. The reality is, if they were running the banks back then, they were essentially de facto leaders of Germany.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it goes as far back as I know, like Charlemagne himself, one of the guy considered the father of Europe. He had invited court Jews to handle his finances. He took massive loans from them. He gave them special legal privileges. As far back as that time, the who's could only be tried by their own courts. They basically had legal immunity in a lot of cases. It's the history of it goes, and you have to wonder also, like, basically the Catholic Church gave them a monopoly on lending, which made them extraordinarily rich. And someone like Miles Mathis, who I know Miles Mathis has attacked me before and called me a spook, but I still like his work, because what he's done is he's taken it as far back as like the Phoenicians, which this is kind of taking the conversation in a different route. We can go back to Keith Woods in a second, but I do think one view that I have of history in general is, I think the first group to establish these tactics, these methods of control, these methods of money making, and these monopolies of trade, once that empire was established and certain families got that down, I think it only snowballed and accumulated from there. And we've essentially only seen behind their empires have come and go, but these money powers, I think, go back thousands of years, and that these are methods that they've tuned and perfected to the point where it's a runaway effect, where no one can catch up after that's been established.
Yes, that's the conclusion I came to as well. I mean, I personally think I've always thought it's gone back 250 years to the Rothschilds, but when I looked into it, I thought, well, hang on, where did they get their power from? And then I sort of twigged, this must go back 3,000 years. And I think our ancient ancestors would have totally understood that, because they were very religious, and religious people understand that groups are in a sort of a game of dominance, and that they're happy to work over centuries to do that. I think part of the problem today with white people in the West, and this goes for people like Keith Woods, is that they're atheistic. They don't understand being part of a religious group which thinks over time. They don't understand things like sacrifice, including sacrificing your own people in order that in 200 times you will have power. But I think our ancient ancestors would have understood all this. What were the other points I was going to make? In the protocols, right, they talk about how, and this was written about 1897, they talk about how at that point they're literally kings of the world already. And they mention the Tsar of Russia and say that they were good, but they basically know already before the Bolshevik Revolution that they've got them on toast. And they talk about the Catholic Church being a good enemy, but that again, by this point in 1897, they've got them under the belt. So it's very interesting that I totally agree with your point, which is that once this begins, there's no getting out of it, and it is literally just a snowball effect. Let me mention just a second, Arya Satcher, who is in the chat, who is a big fan of you, Apollonian Germ. She has a beef with me that it is actually the Jesuits and not the likes of the Rothschilds who are in charge of this. I don't agree with that, but Arya, we will try and get you on at some point in a future show, and you can come on and make your case about the Jesuits.
That would be interesting. I have something to say about the Jesuits, actually. The first school that I went to when I was 18, because I've been to 2 universities. The first school was Loyola, Chicago, and that's considered sort of a prestigious school in Chicago. And I was in their honors program, and my first ever taste of this idea that the modern world traces its roots back very far is since I was in the honors program, they forced us to take a class called History of Western Thought. And it was, a very broad overview of the philosophy of the West. And they saw someone like Plato being like one of the basic forefathers of their philosophy. And so that, I think, gave me a foundation of seeing things in these broad, open views of history. And so I kind of got a bit of insider, Jesuit training.
Arya has suggested that you're a Jesuit agent looking to discredit people like Richard Spencer.
He discredits himself, man.
Well, listen, I think there's a few things we can say. We can stop. I was going to mention Greg Johnson and what he's been recently doing, telling people to take the vaccine. Do you fancy talking about that? Do you want to move on to the Rothschilds? What do you want to do, Apollonian?
Well, yeah, I'd talk about Greg Johnson. I'm interested, actually, because once again, leading up to this conversation, I wasn't just listening to Keith Woods. I was trying to catch up on people like Greg Johnson, too. And, it's hard to find, at least for me, I had a hard time finding videos of him speaking. And the ones that I did reminded me how when I first heard Greg Johnson, I honestly thought that he was a pseudonym of Richard Spencer. I thought that he was
Yes.
like, they sound the same. They
That's
sound
so
like
true.
they sound like they went to the same school and grew up in the same neighborhood or something. It was very uncanny. So that, you know, I know that you, Arya says I didn't suggest that, he is joking. I know that, you know, you railed against Greg Johnson for the COVID thing, and that to me, it really is a despicable thing to say. The whole, oh, we need to travel, we need to participate in society to get these political things done, and so you need to get the vaccine. This is not the thing to take a principled stance on. Like, if there was anything to take a principled stance on, I think it is the vaccine. You've gotten into, well, this might get our video taken down. I don't want to get into too many details.
Oh, yes. I'll just say the thing that you don't give medical misinformation, Germ, or it really will go. I've had 2 videos that have come down.
Right.
So if you can try and negotiate yourself around that. I don't want to censor you, though, so go ahead.
Right. Well, the point is, I'm sure everyone watching this knows that there are risks involved in getting injections from strangers. I'll put it that way. If you're going to get an injection from a stranger who is commanding you and holding your life basically hostage, and demanding, like cornering you and standing over you with the big needle, trying to jab it into your arm, that to me is a dangerous situation. And I personally feel like a cornered animal. And in that kind of a situation, I feel like the only options I have are to fight or flee. And for people like Greg Johnson to be taking the side of the doctor, the jabber cornering you, saying, just go ahead and do it, Goy, that is despicable. And just look into it. There's so many articles coming out daily. One that I read was mentioning how these lipid nanoparticles can potentially cross the blood-brain barrier. And if, hypothetically, that happens, the spike proteins are then produced within your neuron cells, and your body would then attack the neurons, which have a hard time regrowing. You know, muscle cells, blood cells, those can regrow. But if your body attacks your neurons, then that can lead to permanent damage. Hypothetically, I'm not making any factual claims here, but hypothetically, if that happened, that would be a bad situation for you. So,
let me just, if anyone wants to download this video when it's finished, just in case it gets snatched very quickly, because I don't really know how to download videos that well. But if anyone wants to take a copy of this video, do so, just because they have been very hot on this medical misinformation. I think you, Mike, you had a strike for this as well, right?
Yes, I did. So, yeah. But, you know, and it kind of leads into another thing about Greg Johnson, which is, you know, he's advocating this because he wants you to be able to travel and go to his conferences and, you know, pay for the tickets to go and see them speak and all that kind of shit. That all revolves around his very like normie political agendas, where they're talking about creating these political parties and getting people into office. And I know back during the election cycle, they were shilling for Trump. That's another big thing about that group of people that I can't stand, that they're still at this point shilling for people like Trump. How is that justifiable? I mean, what did you think about Trump when he was?
Oh, I said in 2015, Trump he's an insider, and he's being used to eclipse genuine outside candidates. There was a really good guy from Texas who was on Press TV. He was a 9/11 truther, but very respectable guy, like in a suit. You know, typical kind of Texan, and he was going to run for office. People like him got nowhere, and people like Trump, I guess, were used to eclipse him. So Trump was definitely controlled from the start. That said, I always said, let's support Trump. It's just the sensible. it's a basic bitch message we can send to the normies that Trump is good because he was kind of red pilling people on a few things. But at once he, I think it was the strike when he made a strike on Syria a few weeks into his office. I was like, you know, we need to dump him. And people like Greg Johnson and Kevin McDonald were still supporting Trump up to the last and telling us why we needed another 4 years of him, because if it's not him, oh my God, the left will get in and everything will go to hell in a handcart, as if it wasn't already going to hell in a handcart anyway. So those are my opinions on the people who support Trump. I remember Greg Johnson, when Trump got in, he said, we need Trump to declare Antifa a terrorist organization. And I remember thinking then, you have got no clue. That would be like George Soros arresting himself. It's not going to happen. That Antifa will be declared a terrorist organization. So I've never been a fan of Greg Johnson. I've always thought he's a very normie conservative type. And it's kind of strange that he mixes in distant circles. But I mean, I'll ask you a question, because you say he sounds so like Richard Spencer, and those two are always arguing. I've always thought Spencer's an agent, Johnson's a useful idiot. But is Greg Johnson actually, is he cleverer than I think? Is he an agent?
I just don't know enough about him. I think the most I ever learned about Greg Johnson was in the last week leading up to this conversation. When I first made my YouTube channel, like back in 2016, I was listening to a lot of these alt-writers. I was ingesting their material and coming up with arguments against what they had to say. But at some point I got so fed up with it and so just disinterested in hearing the same nonsense being repeated over and over that I just kind of tuned out. And he never really interested me. I think one of the only articles I've read on written by Greg Johnson was about Jason Reza Giorgiani, like explaining how it was kind of like spinning Giorgiani's connections, deep state connections, spinning that into a good thing, saying like, oh yeah, well we have our guy who has this connection with Trump now, and that kind of a spin on it. Are you familiar with Giorgiani? Have you looked into his stuff?
I'm certainly familiar with Giorgiani, although I haven't seen everything he's done. We can certainly get into him as well if you like,
because he's connected to Keith Woods too. Keith Woods and him have done shows together, and he's really connected with Richard Spencer, who once again connects back to Keith Woods. There's this whole network that they have going. And one thing about Giorgiani that are you familiar with his take on 9/11?
Yes, you told me about that, and I agree that it's a strange take, because what he's basically saying is that the American deep state found out that it was an inside job, but then in order to save the American public from the horror of knowing that, they then covered it up. Was that what he said?
He even alludes, he's basically saying, yes, it was an inside job, but it's being covered up for our own good, because the horror of realizing that there's this power above our national government, above the national governments anywhere. He even alludes to aliens, surprisingly enough. The horror that the public would experience if they found out the truth was just too much. So they have to fight this battle behind the scenes for our own good. It's the most whacked take I've ever heard of 9/11.
But if I can defend Giorgiani, don't you think that the whole thing with 9/11 is a bit of a mindfuck? Because it's like, the people who did it, I don't think made any attempt to cover it up. It's like, what, you know what I mean? It's like a pack of schoolboys try to do an operation, and they made so many mistakes. So I certainly don't agree with Rajani's conclusions, but I can understand that people look at it and think, well, what the fuck? How do we explain this? Or do you not agree?
No, I agree with what you said to begin with, that it was it was done in such a way that I think anyone really thinking critically about it from an objective standpoint would see, like, clearly the official story that we're told makes no sense. But I've spoken a little bit about this in the past, which is, I think when the elite does something and then explains it in a way that obviously contradicts reality, the people who accept it have the effect that it has on them is to essentially short circuit their critical thinking faculties. Because when you're confronted with something, when somebody, it's an emperor's new clothes kind of a situation. When you see the king walking down the street and you're told that he's wearing the most beautiful robes in the world, but you can see he's naked, to accept that, the people who then accept that are sort of harming themselves in a way, in a spiritual and psychological way. They become harmed by that, and it reduces their capacity in the future to think critically, because once you've accepted something as blatantly of a lie and as blatantly contradictory and nonsensical as that, anytime that you use your critical thinking in the future, I think will remind you of the other things that you should have thought critically about. And so it kind of creates this effect of shutting down people's critical thinking.
Yeah, and I think to anyone who's truly intelligent, it just alienates you from society and thinks, well, what kind of rotten world do we live in? And it sort of leaves you depressed and miserable.
Yeah.
There's obviously, I think we can talk about the 9/11 stuff, but for the minute, do you want to get back to Greg Johnson? The other thing, you see, the reason I know who Greg Johnson is because he's always been friends with Millennial Woes. And this has created a huge problem, because I slagged off Greg Johnson the other day, and he doesn't take any interest in that. But I end up getting into a fight with Millennial Woes. It's kind of sad because I've always had a good relationship with Millennial Woes, but it's very interesting how so much of this rests on kind of personalities and friendships between people. And I don't know what you think about that.
I saw your videos. I watched those videos on Greg Johnson, and then the video you put out afterwards, the 1 hour video of talking about the whole situation with Woes. I watched all that. I have a lot of free time at work. So yeah, I drive a tow truck, so there's a lot of driving.
I was going to say, do you get to listen to content when you're driving?
Yeah, that's pretty much all. It's one of the major fringe benefits of the of the job is I'm driving for like an hour and a half. And so anyway, I listened to all that, and yeah, it is a shame because one thing I really like about you is you have a view of yourself that is similar to my view of myself, which is you think, and I think, that we have voices and opinions and analyses that ought to be heard. We both feel like we deserve to be heard and taken seriously, and not just brushed aside, not just ignored, not just labeled one thing or another. We both feel like we deserve to be taken seriously, and it's I'm sure to you it felt like a betrayal when you say these things and you have these opinions about someone like Johnson, and then someone who you considered a friend, Millennial Woes, responds to you by basically creating emotional pressure and social manipulation to try to get you to buzz off that issue. That, to me, I would personally feel quite upset by that, because
I want to be fair to Millennial Woes because he's not here to speak. I think he's genuinely just standing up for his friend Greg Johnson, and also Woes is entitled to have a go at me because I'm very bitchy. So if Woes is slightly bitchy towards me, that's fine. I think the issue is that maybe lots of people in the distant right don't understand how important the issues of vaccines is. It's like they're still in a limbo zone, like a twilight zone of thinking, well, are they bad? Are they not bad?
Right.
Maybe the conspiracy theorists are right. Whereas every conspiracy theorist knows, don't take the vaccine. And so I had to counter Greg Johnson's statement.
Yeah, well, and I also want to be fair to Woes because he's had me on his millennial twice. I've never had a personal problem with Woes. I like what he does with the millennial and getting as many different voices as he can, giving them the platform, and I have to be grateful to him because he was one of the people who gave my channel a platform and exposed me to a lot of new audience. So Woes, if you're listening or if you ever hear this, I have nothing against you personally. I think you've done a good job. But I think one of the biggest, I'll ask you what you think personally, but to me, one of the biggest frustrations would be that, for example, you sent an email. Didn't you say you sent an email to Greg Johnson asking to debate and he just completely ignored you?
Yes.
So you can have this like third party discussion with Johnson by making a video and Woe saying something about it, and then Johnson getting in the comments and saying this shit, but he won't say anything to your face and he won't get on live stream with you and have the debate. And that's kind of where I was going earlier when I was saying, you and I both feel like we have voices that deserve to be heard. It's very frustrating when somebody who you challenge, who you say, you're wrong. The way I feel about it is like, it's like we're all in a town hall meeting and these people are up front. They're part of the city council or whatever. And you're a town member and they're saying something you disagree with. And you stand up and you say, I disagree. And here's why. And all that happens to you is you either get ignored or shouted down or called this or that name. And that's not how a public forum should work. So that's kind of.
Yeah, no, that's a very important point. I should say, in fairness to Greg Johnson, he did do a debate with JF and with Andrew Anglin. Woe said to me that it's simply a case that Greg wouldn't have time to answer all his emails, to which I will say, why then does he have time to go on Twitter and call people like me irrational and insane and vaccine cranks and all this kind of thing? So I don't forgive Greg Johnson for not getting back in touch. If I'm supposed to be diplomatic about these things, he should reply to my entreaties. But you're absolutely right. And I said the other day that this was maybe a generational thing, because like if someone came making a video about me, like challenging my debate, challenging my opinions, I couldn't imagine anything other than like taking them on. Like where is the manly quality within these people to want to dominate, to want to say, no, I'm right and here's why, and I can take your challenge. All of these people seem to have this habit of just running off and just ignoring people. And I literally, it escapes me how these people can live with themselves.
Yeah, that's always to me been one clue for me, at least in my very conspiratorial outlook on the world. It's always been a clue to me when a certain person seems like they're behind a partition, where they have this vast distance between themselves and their audience. Like it's very hard to get in contact with them. It's very hard to have a serious conversation with them. It's very like I've always tried with my channel to be extremely interactive with my audience, because I'm not here. I'm not here to just follow a script or to push an agenda. I'm here to have a conversation with people. I'm here to analyze, debate, discuss all that kind of stuff with people. And that's something that a lot of people, like it seems like Greg Johnson or Richard Spencer, lack that interface. It seems like there's a partition, that they're following the script and they don't want to be contradicted.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. I don't know whether that's like a generational thing as well, maybe because us, we, like the YouTube generation, sort of has this understanding that you've got commenters and people in the chat. I don't know whether Greg Johnson is like a boomer who wants to write for a sort of newspaper and never sort of get any feedback. That's possibly that. What else were we going to talk about? We're coming up to the hour mark. Do you want to move on to something else now, or have you got any further thoughts? on this sort of particular topic?
No, I think we've said a lot on it, and we might even come back to it, I'm sure, at some point. But at the moment, yeah, I'm all done with
Do you write things down during the talk? Because I always have a little notepad with me. I don't know whether you do that.
No, I typically don't.
Yeah.
I probably should.
Oh, I wasn't suggesting you should. I often write things down because it's very easy to forget things. Let me come to the email then that you sent me with the things we were going to discuss. Okay, the second point, the major point that you've put, is to discuss the Rothschilds and your view of them compared to mine, find common ground and where we might disagree. I think at this stage, a lot of people have know my view of the Rothschilds. Do you want to kickstart this, Mike, or should I?
Well, so I kind of want to find something that was written down here.
You find that, and I will just give a brief resume of my views on the Rothschilds, especially for people who are solely fans of Apollonian Germ and who might never have heard my takes before.
Please.
I personally think that the Rothschilds are part of a 3,000-year-old conspiracy, and although this 300-year-old conspiracy to take over the world has employed the most despicable Machiavellian methods in order to get to that point, my ultimate belief is that when the Rothschilds take complete power of the world, they will be benevolent. And so everything that the New World Order is suggested to be is not actually true. And every person at this moment in time, especially dissidents and conspiracy theorists, are people who hate the old world order. They hate everything about the current situation we are in. And at some point, they're going to demand a new world order, which will be the opposite of the current state of affairs in every single way. And when they do demand that, the Rothschilds will then come along and say, right, we can give you this benevolent world that you want. The only price you have to pay is that we are kings of it and we will have complete power. So, Mike.
Okay, so there's a lot I disagree with there. This will be an interesting part of the conversation, I'm sure.
Indeed, but let's have it because people want to hear this.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that the world order that they want to establish, where they are absolute kings, absolute rulers, can only be brought to bear, and I think they understand this, by destroying everything that I personally, and I think a lot of my followers and a lot of people in my circles, destroying everything that we cherish, which is things like ethnic homogeneity, ethnic homelands for our people, traditional family structure, for example, anything that generates hierarchy and unity that is outside of their control. That has to be eradicated because it's essentially when you have a homogenous ethnic group and you have strong patriarchal family clans and family structures, that creates a nucleus of hierarchy and of power and of independence and autonomy that cannot be controlled by the state. And that is, I think, why you see whenever things like these communist authoritarian states are put into place and what you see today in the West being implemented, when you see these sorts of things happening, like the destruction of the nuclear family, like the mixing and blending of the races, these sorts of issues, the destruction of traditional gender norms and identities, all of that is done because those are centers of power that they don't have control over. And the world that sees a messianic age of, who-ish rule, where they're open about it and they uncloak themselves and reveal the light of their Luciferian glory, that would be an age of, like Kalergi talked about, an undifferentiated brown mass of slaves that have no power for themselves. And I don't want that world. I'd rather have a world where there are warring ethnic tribes, where there are separate spheres of power, where there is this kind of dynamic situation, rather than an end of history kind of a state where it's just the true race, the true Jewish ruling race over the undifferentiated mixed mulatto mass. So that's the first thing. I have other things, but you can respond to that.
Okay, to respond to that, I certainly think that when the Rothschilds get to power, they're not going to like restore pure ethno states, because you're right. If there's only, let's say, white people in Britain, that will cause greater unity than if there's different multicultural groups. So I do agree with that. I also agree that strong families will cause resistance to them. And that the reason that the family unit has been broken down over the last 50, 100 years is because they wanted to get us to this point. But here's where I disagree, because once they've got us to this point where they have absolute power, they can really afford to give us back the things which are good and true. And that is what will unite us to them. So the fact is that every family going forward, let's say in Britain, will relate to the king. They'll relate to the king, and they'll look at the king's family and they'll think, well, my family is like the king's family, and the king has given us he's returned these family values. Isn't the king really great? I really love that. I'm not saying they're going to give you back ethno states like they were, but I definitely think they will give us ethnocentric states, and they will say, hang on, this multicultural stuff is bollocks. This Kalergi plan is bollocks. And, the native inhabitants of each of the Western European cities, they have to remain supermajorities. They have to remain, first citizens. So I think that's how they're going to sell it to people. And although I agree about your idea that, strong nations and strong family units could challenge their authority, I think their authority is just so big at this point that they don't have to worry about that. But at the same time, they can create the hierarchy that with them at the top, and if let's say Britain becomes a strong nation again with strong family values and strong families, each of those families will kind of worship the king as being the benefactor who led to this stability.
See, that's interesting speculation. I would disagree because for a couple of reasons here. The first is I mentioned earlier, going to Loyola and getting that Jesuit training, and the father of all academic philosophy is Plato. And this is, I think, if you've taken any philosophy classes in any university anywhere in the world at this point, you're going to learn Plato, and he's going to be considered like one of the greatest influences on philosophy anywhere. And that's because Plato, who, by the way, was part of a very wealthy merchant family, he, I think, was an early example of one of these kinds of international merchant elites. He laid the blueprint of his republic, which discusses having things like everything, the masses would share everything in common, no private property. The marriages would be chosen by the state. Well, not really even technically marriages, but just matches for breeding would be chosen by the state. Children would be taken by the state at birth and raised in a communal fashion. All of these things to create a situation where humanity as a whole is reformed at the most basic level to exist as controllable cogs in the machine, slaves, essentially, high-level slaves. And even as recently as Julian Huxley, the first chairman or CEO or whatever the title is of UNESCO. He talked about in his book New Bottles for New Wine, the eradication of the old, quote, old human nature, which is tribalistic, which is national, patriotic, oriented toward these what he considers to be backwards values, and completely changing that for a new man, for a new future of society. So I don't see, once this process has occurred, once this transformation, it's basically like an alchemical kind of transformation has occurred, there's no putting Humpty Dumpty back together. Essentially, there's no once that egg is cracked, whatever they reform us into. So the old maxim, the old saying in like Kabbalah and alchemy and Luciferianism of solve et coagula, the dissolving and then recoagulating of things. Whatever they recoagulate us into is not going to resemble the old system of humanity or the old human nature concept that we have. So I think you're being optimistic.
Well, maybe I am, but I will say it's not, just to be clear, when I first got into conspiracy theories, I heard all of this stuff from people like James Corbett and others, and I took it to be true. But things kind of changed my mind, because I just think in some ways it's just so insane. Like introducing transgender people, or transgender women reading, transgender men, men dressed up as women, going into kids' schools and reading them stories, and people being, arrested if they have a problem with this. That just smacks to me of trying to get a reaction out of people. It's just so insane. I don't see what they stand to gain by these things. But if I can come to the protocols, the protocol says specific things. It says we will show to the people that progressivism has limits, and all of this silly liberalism really has limits. We will show to them, and we will restore order. And I take that as I just think that's interesting, because to me that's basically like they're saying, all this kind of progressive and liberalist agenda that we're having, they're going to come in and stop it and reverse it. And the other thing, for example, they say lots of different things in the protocols, but they talk about getting rid of capitalism and replace, giving the working man, they talk about how the working man is forced to work soul-sapping jobs for big corporations, and that has to be done away with, and you need to have small and medium-sized businesses, and that the working man will not be paid taxes. And to be honest, so if what you're saying is right, how would you explain these sorts of passages in the protocols?
Well, that is something that I think is true as well about them creating so much chaos, so much disorder, so much stress in society as a whole, that people eventually snap and beg for whatever comes in to establish order. But that order doesn't have to resemble the old order. That order could be something like Plato's Republic, where like I've already described, the state has this absolute authority over even something as simple as matching people in marriages for breeding, taking the children, raising them communally, just having this undifferentiated mass of equal citizens, everyone being equal, everyone mixing. That all can be orderly as well. It's just a different kind of order that does away with the old hierarchies and establishes a new permanent, like almost 1984 style of hierarchy.
I would just say that the whole ethos that I get from the protocols is that they laugh at the state of society, which has become infected by cultural Marxism. They laugh at the goyim for not having a religion. They laugh at them for not having a king. They laugh at them for thinking that egalitarianism works, or that liberalism works, or that progressivism works. And I think you can only laugh at these things if you have a good understanding that they're totally unnatural and totally ridiculous. And I don't see, if in my belief is they're going to reveal themselves as kings of the world. But if we're still living in a cultural Marxist world, who's going to, then people will not have so much loyalty to the king. People will say, well, fuck the king. We don't do hierarchy here. And that's why I think that's another reason why I think that if you're going to come in as kings of the world, you had better inculcate in people a sense of hierarchy.
Yes, I agree with that. But here, another thing that occurred to me while you were just talking was how if we trace this back through Jewish mysticism, we can see in the past how one thing that I heard in a video about, do you know about Sabbatean Frankism, that particular strain of thought? And
I have a decent enough idea. So
in Sabbatean Frankism, one of their, and by the way, this was a movement, a messianic movement in Judaism that basically stated that it was all of the commandments, all of the entire moral code that was taken for granted at the time is meant to be inverted and reversed. So if it's wrong to commit adultery, according to the mainstream, then the Sabbatean Frankists would say, well, actually, it's morally good to commit adultery, and they followed through with this. They would have wife swapping parties. They would have pretty much anything morally degenerate that you can imagine. They did it, and including like pedophilia, murder, all kinds of things. And this was an extremely popular group, messianic movement during the 17 and 1800s. Or sorry, it started, this Sabbateanism, the original, started in like 1666, which they believed was an auspicious year for the Messiah to come because of 666. And then after that, Frankism popped up again in the late 1700s. It ties in with the Illuminati. Some of the original Illuminati figures were Frankists. It turns out that continuing on, sort of a neo-Frankist, the Frankist families obtained for themselves positions of high power, including they were members of the U.S. Supreme Court, for example. Louis Brandeis, I never know how to say his name, Brandeis, a Supreme Court member, was from a Frankist family. There are all kinds of high-profile Frankists, and they believed in this moral inversion, and they participated in all kinds of this degeneracy. And I think one of the main tenets was something like evil exists in the minds of the goyim, that because we are chosen, because we are God's chosen people, we are the elect Cohens, Elusus Cohens, or whatever. We have the right, we have the ability to do whatever we want, and it's not evil. Evil is for the goyim. That's something to control them. That's something that they that we impose on them, and us elect can indulge in these luxuries and still be beloved by God. And I think today, when you look at a lot of the elites, you see them, like Epstein being one of the biggest examples, engaging in all kinds of degenerate acts. And I think they see these sorts of things like pedophilia, like ritual murders, like wife swapping, and all kinds of these sorts of things. Sam Hyde, actually, of all people, told a story of this Greek architect or something who was very very good at his work, and he got completely blacklisted by the quote unquote Illuminati or the secret societies of the time because he wouldn't engage in wife swapping parties. So I think a lot of these high society people see themselves as privileged, and not just privileged financially and socially, but morally, and that they can do what they want and it's fine for them. But for the cattle, for us, we need to follow moral guidelines. We need to be good dogs, good slaves, and do what we're told. And these luxuries should be reserved for them, just as any other luxury should be reserved for them. We don't get to ride in yachts. We also don't get to wife swap or have sex with children or things like that. I think that's how they see it.
Yes, listen, I don't, I'm not going to dispute that in any great depth. I mean, one thing I talk about there being a benevolent world that's coming up, but I do think these people will still continue to engage in things like pedophilia and ritual murder. I don't, however, think they'll engage in things like wars, and in general, I think they'll be benevolent, but I think they have a different code sometimes with some of the things. There's so much I could say about this.
Oh, but war is the biggest ritual murder.
Okay, well, when I talk about ritual murder, I mean like the occasional sacrifice of like a virgin or something.
Right.
I shouldn't be surprised if that happens, but in my worldview, I do think wars will come to an end, and that's certainly something they say in the protocols. There's so many different things I could say to this. There's two major things that I want to come back on, but let me say this first. Here's a big question. You think that your people are in danger, or you think humanity is in danger, which way you want to put it. And so the question is then, how would you resolve this? And let me tell you my answer, because when I first got red pilled, I thought, fucking hell, these elites are terrible. They're awful. We have to get rid of them. And so what I did is I went around telling people, about 9/11, about the Rothschilds, etc., and everyone laughed in my face. And so I very quickly came to the conclusion is that, we can't do this by word of mouth. We can't. The normies aren't on our side. But I'll tell you, I do have a slight idea about how I could defeat the Rothschilds, and it's this. I'm going to use the exact same tactics that they have used for centuries. And that is this. I'm going to use violence and psychological manipulation. So I'm going to use violence on the normies. And when the normies are on the wrong end of a false flag, I'm going to come along and which was done by me, I'm going to come along and say it was the Rothschilds. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this in every nation on the planet. And I'm going to do it across 3,000 years. And if I do all of that, if I keep doing these false flags on the normies and keep telling them it's the Rothschilds, we can get to the point where not only do we defeat the Rothschilds, but I become king of the world. And when I become king of the world, I will make everything absolutely right. That's my strategy for defeating the Rothschilds. But the thing is, of course, is that anyone can see that that's, what's the point of that? Because the Rothschilds could equally argue that that's all that they have been doing for the last, 3,000 years, say. So do you see my point? And if it was left to you, how would you save humanity, or how would you save your tribe from this dilemma?
Well, I think unfortunately, I agree with you about your misanthropy. I'm basically on board with that, and I think most people they've literally been bred to be of a cattle mindset, and their breeding and biological existence is defined by and structured by the current state of the world. It's kind of like, if you tried to go to a commercial farm and release the cows from their pens, they would not survive in the wild. They've literally changed species from the wild oxen, the aurochs that used to exist, into something different. They can't be reformed. They can't be changed. Essentially, there's nothing to be done for them. They're dependent. So that's how I feel about most people, unfortunately. And I'm, as much as I say, I'm misanthropic, I get along well with people. Growing up, I was popular in school. I was never an outcast or a loner. I played on the football team in high school. Had my fair share of girlfriends. All this kind of, like, I was never
like me.
But at the same time, as much as I love people for who they are, I do feel like they're biologically slave. They're biologically enslaved. And so I don't have much hope for a political solution. I don't have much hope for some kind of grassroots activism solution, any kind of revolution. I don't have any hope for those kinds of things, unfortunately. What I do have hope for are that there are people that, like Nietzsche described, like Übermensch, who are they've somehow avoided or are less degraded than the average. And that people like me or you or other people who are out there who feel like they don't fit in to society and the way that things are going, that we develop autonomy for ourselves, that we somehow get as independent as we can from the system as it is, which involves things like homesteading, growing your own food, getting livestock for yourself, generating your own electricity, getting along as much as you can without relying on this system that they've created. And because, sorry, just
please,
one more point, because I believe, and this might be my optimism, you have the optimism that they'll go to something better. I have the optimism that what they're doing is unsustainable, and that eventually, no matter how much they think they can control things, and no matter how much control they actually have in reality, they do have a lot of control. The control that they have is incredible. But what they don't have control over is the fundamental laws of reality. And I think that we are going to reach a point similar to are you familiar with the Calhoun mouse experiments?
Yes, where the mice started being gay and that kind of thing.
Right, and there reaches a certain level of population, and especially population density, that is unsustainable, and eventually some kind of biological switch is flipped, and instead of increasing in population, there's a sharp decline, a sharp drop, not just a sudden slope down, but a crash down, like the crypto markets have been in lately. And once that happens, I want to be one of the people who is autonomous, not one of the people that goes crawling to them saying, please, I will, whatever you can do to restore order, because that will be the situation where power is fully consolidated, and that I think would be the moment where they do reveal themselves and become open kings. And I want to be one of those barbarians who are still out in the wilderness that doesn't come crawling into their system of control.
Sure. There's so many things that I want to say. I mean, just to be clear, in high school, I mean, I did actually play for the football team, but I was still hated, and probably even more that I was a nerd who was good at football. So I was really much hated at high school. I haven't really had any friends since I was age 13. And I do think this just plays into my mentality of like, in the final analysis, I couldn't give a shit about people. And I realized a long time ago, I'm never going to get anything from the mob. The mob will never give me anything. And therefore, I will always be willing to sell myself to the elites who might make use and, recognize and appreciate my intelligence And that's something that is very, very important for me. And it's kind of, I think a lot of people think it's inhumane, but I look at my personal circumstances and I think, well, you know, if I was left to the mob, they would savage me. But to go back to your thing, right? So you might be able to. It sounds a nice idea that you live, let's say, off grid, and you have your own community and you take care of yourself. But isn't that just an upward struggle? And also, would it not bother you that some normies might come by your small community, like in a truck, and start pointing fingers and laughing at you? And you would then say, you know, because you're not going along with the program. Would you not then say, for fuck's sake, we're way smarter than you, and you don't get the right to come and take the piss out of us, even though we're living in the correct way?
Well, I wouldn't care about being mocked. I'm getting an echo, by the way, at this. It's the first time of the entire conversation that I've got.
Okay, that's my Jewish business kicking in. I don't know. Is that any better?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't mind being mocked, and the thing that I would worry about would be if like I'm anticipating some kind of collapse happens and the power is consolidated, then instead of people coming out to mock us, they come out to round us up and curtail us or whatever, cull us maybe even. That would be the worry. But in that case, I would rather die defending something that I own. I'd rather go down in that way, defending my own home and property and family and community, rather than having this slow enslavement in the city, this reduction of my dignity as a human being. I'm not sure how else to respond.
What I feel is that, like, as what I did I became a conspiracy theorist in order to help humanity, and as the reward that I got was being, kicked in the teeth and shitted on by a bunch of people who are of inferior intelligence to me. And so I'm thinking, well, I'm not gonna take one for the team when the team doesn't even like me. And so my philosophy is that if I'm not going to be a cuck, if I'm going to have any pride, on some level, I have to say, screw the normies. And to repeat, I really came from this from a good position. I was literally like, trying to tell people we all need to wake up to save humanity. And, all I got back was shit. And it's like, well.
Yeah, this seems like a weird segue into an answer, but I think you mentioned in a comment that you liked my music at some point.
Yes.
So one of my only original songs, Last Will and Eternal Testament. Have you heard that one?
I'm sure I have. I wouldn't remember the name.
One of the lines is, I think it opens with, I want to feel every muscle wrapped on bone. I want to love everyone I've ever known. And that line comes out of something where I truly feel that way. I truly feel like I wish everyone that I've ever known was someone I could love and someone I could feel like a deep human connection with. And I've had lots of friends in my life that especially growing up, that I believed would be friends for life, and they aren't anymore. Like, I don't even talk with most of the friends that I had growing up, despite the fact that they were very close, good friends. And like on my block, there were a couple different families, and I always imagined we'd grow up and have children on the same block, living on the same block, and our kids would play out front, and our kids would go and play at the same hill in the forest, and all these kinds of things that I imagined growing up. And I think that comes from maybe like an instinct of mine, like a sort of an ancestral memory of growing up in some kind of village somewhere in Germany or in Norway or wherever my ancestors came from, and knowing everyone in that village and having your children know the children of everyone in that village, and having that sort of a deep rootedness to your life and to your existence, and being a part really belonging there. And so I feel that I really have a drive for that. And there are times when I still think back on the friends that I had and think like, I want to reach out to them or whatever. But I know at this point that if we ever really connected again, at some point, these opinions would come out. At some point, they would discover what I advocate for now, and they would just completely reject it. There would be no talking about, there would be no connecting after that. So I have that, but at the same time, I think because this is getting into psychology, so I'm it's not my favorite thing to psychologize about things, but maybe because I did fit in, I did belong, my trauma, the trauma that I experienced from, and the pain that I experienced once I grew up and started to realize that society is as fucked as it is, and that people are as dumb and slavish as they are, unfortunately, that trauma was fully processed, and I kind of got over it. And so at this point, all I want is to get past that and reestablish it somehow, recreate it somehow, and create it for my children. So that's the dream of creating some sort of autonomous community, is to really somehow manifest that again in reality in a way that more closely resembles the ideal that I had growing up.
I mean, but can I ask you though, right? Because I said, your songs are very, very good. There's really sharp lyrics in there. Do you not feel bitter that, I mean, do you not want to go anywhere with that? Do you not feel bitter that you're consigned to, quite a, you do a working class job, as you've said many times in your videos? Does that not make you bitter? Especially when you see garbage, you see Lady Gaga getting paid $1 million for doing shit.
Yeah, my dream when I first went off to college was to continue, get a master's, get a PhD, become a teacher, become a philosophy professor. I would have loved to do that. And despite that, and despite the fact that, I'm not making much money, being a tow truck driver, it pays the bills, it gets me by, it gives me enough to put some money in the bank, but I'm not making what I would as a tenured professor at a nice university. I don't have the social status that I would. Those kinds of things, yeah, at some level they bother me. But at the same time, I don't know if it's just a general feeling of optimism, or of some kind of weird innate happiness that I have, but I've come to like towing cars. It's kind of interesting at this point. Like it's something that I find some enjoyment in, and I like working with my hands. I like doing manual labor, despite the fact that I would like to be a professor. I like to I try to get along with the people that I know, and I try to find good things and all that. I have a beautiful wife. I have a beautiful daughter. I'm working toward the homestead ideal. So, yeah, on some level it makes me upset. And this is something, like earlier I mentioned how you and I both feel like we deserve to be heard. When I got that suspension from YouTube, I almost made a video about, like, a long rant about how upset that made me, because like I don't mean to like get too much into my own personal biography, but growing up, I was the smart kid in school. I was the kid that everyone asked for help from on anything related to science or history or anything academic. I was the guy that people would ask for help from. And I know that my average peer was on some level not as bright, and on some level not as interested. in as me in a lot of these things. And I know that growing up, despite the fact that I have friends who became lawyers, friends who became medical professionals, friends who became engineers, these like sort of higher level professional positions, I know that they are the type of people who in general don't think critically. They're good at memorizing, they're good at studying and by rote repetition getting things down, and within their very tiny field they're good, but in general they're not the types of people to question authority. They're not the types of people to think critically about society as a whole, to have a broad understanding, to be interested in getting into all these different topics that we get into. And so I know that the average person out there isn't looking at things in the way that they should. And so when I get suspended from YouTube for a week and I'm told I'm promoting medical misinformation, part of me is like, well, I should be the guy that you come to ask help from. You shouldn't be suspending me. You should be promoting me. Like you've said, I should be in some kind of position where I'm still asked for help on these issues. Everyone I knew growing up was this way. I guarantee most people are also going to be that way. So yeah, that
you see, I want to take this point from Featherstone Rover in a second, but let me ask you, Apollonian Germ, then. So is there no way, like, if you got the chance of a really nice job at a university teaching philosophy, and you had time to explore whatever topics you want to read, but then also to teach, but teach with a passion, not just some garbage that is often taught these days, would you honestly say, no, I'm going to live on a homestead, screw your new world order? You might be able to pay me off as a philosophy lecturer, with a cushy job at a good university, but I say no out of principle. Would you really do that?
Well, it depends on a couple things. If I was tenured and guaranteed that I couldn't lose my job, and that I could say whatever the hell I wanted, explore whatever the hell I wanted, all that, even if I got like backlash for it, as long as I was guaranteed the job, I would do it for a few years. I would do it maybe for a decade and save up as much money as I could, and then I would definitely want to get onto the homestead for the sake of my daughter, especially, and for the sake of my future children, because I think as much as people would like to think that they can raise their children and avoid the perfidious influence of the you-know-whos and the mass media and social pressure, it's very difficult if they're still within an environment that they're exposed to all of it. And unfortunately, that is,
See, in my view of what's going to happen when the Rothschilds come in and take over, they're gonna essentially, provided you don't get too lippy, they will sort of make heroes out of all of us who were on the right side of history, and they will give us the chance at least to do something, to have some kind of fulfillment in life of our sort of intellectual capacities. But anyway, let me just answer this question from Featherstone Rover. He says, envy gets you nowhere, Thomas. And this I've heard a lot of this from people criticizing me over the last few days, and it's a bit like similar to what Millennial Woes suggested. I'm not envious of anyone, right? That's like me saying that the people in the nationalists you're envious of immigrants. Just give it up. Just forget about it. It's not about being envious of anyone. It's about seeing people in positions of power who are clearly less intelligent than me, and me knowing that in any natural order, in any natural hierarchy, I would be on top of them. And it's absurd. It's absurd. It's absurd. It's absurd not to be angry. It's like Millennial Woes saying, well, I shouldn't be on the BBC. Owen Jones and Ash Sakar should be on the BBC because they're way more cleverer than me, and I should just be relegated to YouTube or having my channel banned. No, what Millennial Woes should be envious of Ash Sakar and Owen Jones, who are utter midwits of the highest caliber who talk SJW nonsense. Millennial woes should be passionately angry and envious of them that they get all the rewards in society and he gets his channel shut down and is ostracized from society. So it's not about envy, or it is about envy, but it's a righteous envy.
I think it's indignation at some level and just a sense of injustice.
Yes, indeed. Listen, Mike, we have only 15 minutes left. There's so much more we could talk about. What would you desperately like to talk about in the last 15 minutes?
That's a good question.
The two options that you gave me are discuss our opinions on nationalism and political hierarchy. You say, I am basically anti-politics, but not anti-hierarchy. My libertarian past partially informs my current opinions, and we could probably have a chat in that regard.
Right. Well, we talked a bit about, I guess, hierarchy and a bit about nationalism, and you've called yourself an internationalist, but you still kind of sympathize with ethnic.
Yes, I believe that the best way to the best way to run the planet is that every country is run according to what the local people want, and in all countries that's essentially ethno-nationalism or ethnocentric nationalism. It doesn't have to be pure, but the native inhabitants have to be a supermajority, and things have to be run in their way. I mean, maybe I could ask you about the whole business, the distinction between nationalists and conspiracy theorists. I mean, which of those two things are you first and foremost?
Well, that's a good question. I wouldn't say that I
don't like the distinction.
I don't like the distinction, but to speak to the interests of my channel, what I'm most interested in researching and talking about are the conspiracy theories. I'm way more interested in figuring out questions about what has really happened in history, which, by the way, a great channel for history is a guy named Didymus Sumidid. That's Didymus Sumydid. Didymus. He is probably the best historian that I've seen on YouTube. So check his stuff out. I love history. I love getting into the tangled web of the machinations behind the scene and figuring out how power has been taken and consolidated, figuring out really where things began, the genealogies, like I've mentioned earlier, with the interconnecting families. That is fascinating to me. I
mean, I've had a lot to say on this issue. I've often said that I do support the nationalists, but they fail to understand the overall conspiracy, and that is something that really annoys me. And I guess the other issue is that I don't have that much love for white people in general. And I do have lots of friends from different races. I mean, where do you sit on all that thing? Where?
Well, the way I see it is, I grew up in a suburb of Chicago, and it was very diverse. The town that I live in, I think, has always been, well, at least since I was young, it's been about a third white, a third Hispanic, and a third Black. And so growing up, I had friends of every race, color, creed, religion. When I was in middle school, which is ages like 12 or 13 to 14, 15, my tight, I pretty much knew everyone, but my tight group of friends was an Indian, a Muslim Albanian, a half Black, half Swedish guy, and me. It was like the four of us that would hang out pretty much every day. And I saw nothing wrong with that when I was growing up. And looking back on it, I still have nothing against them personally, but as we got older, we drifted apart. We ended up just sort of drifting into different friend groups. The half black guy started hanging around with black people more, and I just didn't get along with them that way. The Indian guy, I don't know where he kind of went off on his own. The Muslim guy kind of went off on his own too. And of all the people that I meet, it seems like the more they resemble me physically, the easier it is to get along with them, and the more we click. There's it's not a guarantee. Obviously, there are some people, white people, who might look exactly like me, and I'm not going to get along with them. But in general, if I were to visit a town, if I were to visit a different country, or if I were walking around somewhere that I was unfamiliar, and I'm seeing black people walk by, Muslim people walk by, Arab, Indian, whatever, and also people who look like me, I would feel way more comfortable approaching someone who looked like me. And in general, it's just my experience that, talking to you, for example, I know I have red hair and my phenotype is different, but you strike me as someone that we share a lot of background culturally with. This is something actually, for some reason, I thought of, or like, I'm not British. I'm mostly German, Norwegian, some Irish, but somehow Britain is something that, like, my mythology or the legendary understanding that I have of the past, just maybe because we speak the same language, I really connect with.
That's very interesting. I was going to bring this up because I've always known you've had, like, I think it's German and Norwegian ancestry. I think you've talked about on your channel. Is that right? So, I mean, what do you feel toward Europe? Do you have an ancestral desire to return? I have been to America, and I love it. Don't get me wrong, I love America, but in some ways, just standing on the soil in America scares me. In a way, and it makes me want to go back to, like, the comfort of Europe, where I'm less scared. Do you feel anything like that?
So in my life, the only places outside of my home state that I've been have been Norway. I visited family there. I was there for about a month. Mexico, which I've been to like 3 or 4 times now, and Quebec in Canada. And I can tell you right now, going to Mexico gave me that same feeling that you said you had about going to North America. I felt like I was in the dark, moist underbelly of the world, that, like, I just wasn't where I should be. And I felt like I was far away from anything I was familiar with. It just, it gave me anxiety. I had diarrhea the whole time I was there. It's just like, I didn't like it. And part of it was the climate and the environment, but part of it was also walking down the street and seeing people that I knew I couldn't talk to. Even if I speak a little bit of Spanish, because I took it in middle school and high school, but even it wasn't just the language. It was just like, I didn't feel like I belonged. Whereas going to Norway or Canada in Quebec, because this is how I know it's not the language, because I don't speak French, I don't speak Norwegian, but in spite of that, I felt more comfortable being around the French Quebecers and the Norwegians, just because the streets reminded me of home, the architecture looked familiar, the people sort of interacted in a way that was familiar. Everything felt more familiar. So yeah, I think that despite the fact that, I don't get along, there are many white people I don't get along with, and just being white doesn't make you an appealing person to me. But it seems like it's a prerequisite for having a deep connection with somebody, having a real sense of familiarity and shared background and all of that.
Yes, I'm very strange with people. I generally tend to get on better with non-whites, although I'm not saying I've had any deep and meaningful relationships with. I noticed very specifically that the few people I've had deep and meaningful relationships with had a very similar sort of physiognomy to me, alarmingly similar physiognomy to me, almost as if I'd found like a long lost cousin, that kind of thing. But the affinity that I have with the land is very profound. So I will feel very comfortable in Britain or France or any of the Germanic countries or Scandinavia and possibly Italy. But outside of that, I'm very, very, very I'm very, very unhappy if I travel, and I feel like I'm on alien soil.
Well, where in the States did you go, if you don't mind me asking?
I went very briefly to Brown University to give a talk there. It was back in the 2000s. It was so Brown University, Rhode Island, I think it is.
Okay.
I mean, beautiful place, beautiful place. I just had a sort of like a fear, which I can't, like a sort of tension and I mean, you know what? Maybe though, if I went now, maybe I wouldn't feel that. And maybe if I, you know, I don't know, maybe I was young as well. Rhode Island is beautiful. There's a gorgeous library there, which I went into, and I remember comforting myself because they had copies of like ancient Greek plays. And it was a lovely library. But yeah.
Because, you know, apparently millions of years ago, the North America and Europe were connected in one continent, and it split apart, creating the Atlantic Ocean. So, like, there is kind of a truth to the fact that, like, New England and the sort of northeastern area of North America has similar trees, it has similar wildlife, it has, you know, a lot of climactic and environmental similarities. But
it does indeed. And I remember I Googled, I can't remember why I did this, but I Googled a picture of Buffalo, like the countryside around Buffalo, and also a picture of Mexico. And I remember thinking, like, Mexico seemed totally foreign. And this meadow in Buffalo was like so enchanting and inviting. So I mean, as much as I say I felt fear in America, I would feel much more fear in Mexico.
oh, Mexico feels like the underbelly of the world, man. It's just but I would love to visit Britain. That the vistas, the landscapes of like the chalk white cliffs and the rolling grasslands. It just like kind of juts up out of the ocean, and just like a flat, beautiful. It looks like something that a god would make. You know, it's.
Well, I hope you do come across at some point, and you know, there'll be plenty of people here in England who can sort of show you around, and you know, you should, because you've got fans here, you should do what Millennial Woes did with America, come over and do a sort of you know, a tour around England.
I would love to.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure we can get this organized, because Millennial Woes had enough fans to sort of help him through a visit to America. So I think it'd be really good for you to do the same. And I for one would put you up for a bit, and you know, show you some of the best places. But we've got two. Well, you're welcome. Do you want to make any final statements, Apollonian Germ? Because I think we're going to wrap up and keep it under 2 hours, if that's okay.
Yeah, sounds good. I've actually got visitors coming, so it's a good time to end it. I had a good time. This is a great conversation. Let's definitely chat again. I hope you do more videos on these polemics against the alt-right, because those are fascinating. But if I could just make one request or suggestion, it'd be interesting to get more into the sorts of ideas that get you upset, because going back to our original topic, like Keith Woods, you know, one of the things that I think you said was, after trying to hound Keith Woods for a debate, he called you a stalker or something along those lines. And that's it wasn't Woods himself who did this to me, but after making a couple of videos sort of referencing his ideas, I had some of his fanboys come on and say, "Oh, what are you obsessed with Keith Woods for? Why are you making these?" And I was like, that kind of reaction always tells you that you hit a nerve, when people won't respond to the ideas and they just call you obsessed or whatever. So yeah, keep it up. I enjoy your channel, and would like to talk again in the future, hopefully. And yeah,
well, yeah, thanks very much for coming on, Mike. And thanks very much for getting in touch as well, because most people see me as persona non grata. So it was nice that you took an interest in me. And despite all my sort of vitriolic videos out there, you were willing to come on. Kids, thanks very much for listening. We're going to wrap up there. I will be back with more streams in future, and definitely Apollonian Germ will hopefully become something of a recurring fixture. Take care, kids. Goodbye.